more person? Okay, I think we should get started. I will, let people in as they arrive. So welcome everyone to the February edition of the IGRI Research Seminar Series. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Uta Brady. I'm a postdoc at Syracuse University. I'm also the IGRI lab manager. So basically what that means is feel free to contact me if you have any questions or issues related to the research seminar series, the IGRI listserv, the website, whatever. Just give me an email. Send me an email. So today we're welcoming Dr. Lynne Westphal. She's a research scientist with the U.S. Forest Service, operating out of their Northern Research Station in Illinois, I believe. She will be presenting on her very interesting research where she and Dr. Christy Watkins utilized the institutional grammar to code interview transcripts and field notes. So that's really an unusual kind of out of the ordinary approach to using the institutional grammar. So I'm sure that would be very useful and interesting to most of you. Before we get started though, I have two quick announcements. The first one is related to a schedule change. So in order to accommodate some of our international colleagues, we're moving the research seminar series to Tuesdays at noon as of July this year. So not real soon, but in July. So I'll be circulating a reminder email through the listserv, but I did want to draw your attention to that schedule change. And then the second announcement is basically a solicitation. So we're looking for speakers interested in presenting their work on institutional analysis and/or institutional grammar at an upcoming seminar. So the time slots right now are July through December of this year. And obviously that will be at the new time, Tuesdays at noon, first Tuesday of the month. So if you're interested in presenting, I dropped a link into the chat to a Google Sheet, so you can just click on that link and sign up. And of course, if you have any questions, email me. So now without any further ado, let's get started. I'll give the floor to Dr. Westphal.
Thank you, Uta. I'm not seeing the link yet in the chat.
You don't see the link in the chat?
Return or something. So thanks everyone for coming. I would like today to be pretty informal. So if you want me to stop and go over something a little more, if you've got a question, remember that once I'm in presentation mode with PowerPoint, I cannot see the chat pod, so just talk. Okay, and Uta's going to keep an eye on the chat pod, so if you don't want to or don't have the bandwidth, you can type it there. She'll bring it up. But please just let's have this as a conversation. So, but of course, with conversation with PowerPoint. So here we go. Share this. And I'm going to start with, I'm going to start with rearranging the screen. Okay. Does this actually give me a shot at seeing the chat? No, I can see some of you, but I can't see the chat. Okay. So you've got the title. It's the same largely as our paper, People Don't Talk in Institutional Statements. This was work that Christy and I did together intensively, and I was realizing it was like 8-10 years ago that we were working on this. So if I have to stop and think for a moment to come up with an answer, it's because this is from a while back for me. But I wanted to start with a bit of context for like who I am and where I work, because it's not your typical research setting, and then some of the context for the work that we did. So I'm a research social scientist with the U.S. Forest Service. Most people tend to think of Smokey Bear and the national forests when they think of the Forest Service in the US. But as long as we've had the forests, we've also had the research and development branch. We do a lot of our work mostly in Pasteur's quadrant, where yes, we do applied work, but it's also very much in that quest for fundamental understanding as well. We essentially have academic jobs without the teaching. We're expected to publish and all of that. So there is this large research branch looking at social science in the context of natural resource management. And in that, as part of this larger team, we got some NSF funding for through the Coupled Natural Human Systems program for the Restore project, where the basic idea was to look at, when we're looking at ecological restoration, define that in a moment, do we see differences in ecological outcomes depending on the structure and decision-making process and implementation process of the different groups doing the restoration works? Does social structure impact ecological outcome? So ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. It's rooted in ecology, natural relationships, different natural processes that are sometimes unpredictable, but it's very much a human process informed by what we know, don't know, perceptions, values, all sorts of things come into it from the social side of things. Thinking about restoration in the context of common pool resources, it's also a little bit different in that it's more of a value added situation rather than growing and extracting food or timber or those sorts of things. So it's value added. It's also really long term. We had any number of comments from our participants saying things like they're hoping to see some kind of change within their lifetime, as opposed to hoping to have enough food for the winter, for example. And then there are any number of different collective action problems that also turn up within the context of restoration work. Specifically, we were looking at this within the context of Chicago Wilderness, which is an area in and broadly around Chicago, an alliance of 200 some organizations, all focused on conservation. To give you a sense of just how big the area is, that light green around Lake Michigan there, those of you familiar with US geography will recognize that goes way beyond the city of Chicago, up into Wisconsin, even picking up a bit of Southwest Michigan. Everyone who signs on as a member of Chicago Wilderness is signing on to trying to meet the goals of the biodiversity recovery plan. And surprisingly, there's a lot of very special remnant habitats throughout this region. It didn't go under the plow like most of Illinois did. And so there's some globally important habitats throughout the Chicago Wilderness area. This gives you a quick example of before restoration with buckthorn invading an oak woodland. Then all sorts of techniques are applied, from prescribed fire, seeding, cutting out the invasives, et cetera, to get to more of a native, healthier oak, in this case, oak woodland habitat. So the study. We used the IAD framework to outline where we were going to be collecting data. And we collected data both within the action arena and outside the action arena. The ecologists out doing the different biodiversity sampling. We had some agent-based modeling. The part I was more involved in, of course, was the ethnographic work and survey work, both within and outside the action arena. Because of those requirements, we, for in and outside the action arena, the cases we looked at were 10 different Chicago Wilderness organizations, but 14 sites. Some of the organizations had more than one site. Decided on oak woodland rather than also including wetland or prairie and some of the other habitat types as one place where we could cut down on variance in the data. Had to be under restoration activity for at least 5 years, because previous work shows that 5 years is sort of the mark where you start to see some successes and differences because of the restoration work. And because of all of the stuff we wanted, attributes of the community and things like that outside the action arena, we wanted public access, residents living within half a mile of the site as 2 other criteria. So it was quite a tall order to find these things. And we had this a priori sense of different types of management groups. There's a fair amount of co-managed work going on, where there's a public land agency that has these forest remnants, but there's a volunteer group with high levels of autonomy and decision-making doing the restoration work. Then there are other places where the restoration is managed by the paid staff of the organization, the agency that's a Forest Preserve District, Conservation District. There might still be volunteers, but they aren't the decision makers, they aren't in the lead. And then there were a couple of cases that we found where there were research organizations kind of in the lead on the restoration work. So these were our 3 a priori categories. And so we had groups within our cases across each of these. Within the ethnographic data, we had over 80 in-depth interviews. We had over 50 site visits, meeting and workday observations with all the field notes that go with those. All of these data got uploaded into Nvivo, and actually, to help me with this, I forgot to ask, it would help me to have a sense of how many of you are at least somewhat familiar with basic qualitative data analysis methods. And if you could raise your hand or something in the, and Uta, if you could tell me roughly how many people are raising their hands.
I am seeing 1 hand.
I'm seeing a couple.
There's 2 more, so that makes 3.
A smattering.
A smattering, yes,
Okay,
that's a good description.
Thank you. So I'll put a little emphasis then on qualitative data analysis methods and how they didn't help us as we were working in this. So the institutional statements was one part of what we were trying to pull from these data. We were looking, of course, at decision-making information, management actions, perceptions of the landscape, and emotion. And we did a lot using Nvivo, which is one of several different qualitative data analysis softwares that are geared towards assisting the researcher in her or his or their analysis of the data, as opposed to some of the current techniques that are coming out where you can use R or whatever to actually have some machine learning analysis of your qualitative data. These are data softwares that support the researcher going through by hand. So here's a screenshot of our attempt to use Nvivo to code for institutional statements. It failed utterly. I'll just tell you that now. I mean, like, I've never had quite such a face plant in a research attempt before. Total failure. And that's where the name of the paper came from. People don't talk in institutional statements. If you have ever read a transcript of an interview, when I read them, I'm amazed we communicate at all. We use the wrong words. There's so many ums and false starts and reworking it. And so then trying to pull an institutional statement out of those sorts of things gets hard. This particular segment that's showing now is actually one of the clearer versions. So MT is the interviewer and JJ is the staff person being interviewed. And JJ has brought up seeding. So that's the use of taking seeds of native plants and putting them out in your restoration site. And the interviewer asks, so again on seeding, what are the different perspectives? And JJ saying one perspective is it may be somewhat dated, but plant the first wave and then 10 years later, plant another suite of species once the place is stabilized. But some folks say, get everything you can and throw it in there and let it kind of fight and sort itself out. So then how do you resolve that? Like, what do you end up doing and how do you decide? And then JJ laughingly asks if the door is closed, indicating to him or her, I don't remember JJ, that there's something sensitive in this. Well, it depends on the project manager in a sense. A particular site is being moved forward by that project manager, and that's basically how it happens. The other thing that I keep in mind too is that it's a tiny portion of all the work that's being done, and that's one way to do it. Let's try it, and each of us have our nuances. So in these few paragraphs, there are actually any number of institutional statements hinted at, started but not finished. And so our attempt to code to a type, like we see over in the list there, there's aggregation, boundary, choice, etc. We couldn't quite do it. We tried, Christy and I each took the same 10 interviews. We tried coding them for the institutional statements. We ran an inter-rater reliability test, which is where you see how much are you lining up. It sucked. I forget how badly, but it was like maybe 10%. It did not work. And so we went back to the drawing board. I'm going to actually come back to that when I show you first what we came up with. And I am going to stop sharing this because you guys are actually truly into this. So this is one of the spreadsheets that we used, and this is how we ended up going at it. To keep the data confidential, I have changed the agency to Hogwarts. So if you're wondering why there's a Harry Potter reference, it's because I was just blotting out the actual agency name. So we ended up sitting down, read through the interview, and at least I would just read through it without starting to extract anything, then go back, read through it again, and we would pull out from the interview the institutional statement. So we'd have the case and the participant code, and then we would write it in English, just regular language. Do bird banding once every 10 days in growing season. And then we would sort this out into the institutional grammar categories, the attribute, the deontic, the aim, conditions, what the or else or the sanction might be. And then we would do the level. Was it an operational, collective choice, or constitutional? What type of rule was it? And was it a rule, norm, or strategy? And then notes. This note section is actually really important. It gave us clues. We could pull quotes from the interview and put them in there. It was a place where we would make notes. The scope and choice thing is always hard. And we might say why we picked one versus the other. Was it a strategy or a norm? Those sorts of questions could go in there too. So we just went through an initial 10 interviews, pulling by hand this way, reran our inter-rater reliability, and we were over 80%. Oops, wrong one. Oh, great. Sorry. I'm going to blow your bandwidth here. So this way worked, right? And when we went back to look at which institutional statements I might have found or Christy had found and the other one didn't, we realized that we actually very much agreed with each other. So there were some things that we each found and the other one missed, which points to the importance of having more than one person going through these data. So after we had this figured out, we were able to then go on and we each read all of the interviews, but we coded subsets of them, and then we could review with each other. It became this very iterative process. So let's look back at a couple more examples of text. These are out of the paper from Policy Studies Journal, but just to give you a sense of what it looked like in the interview and what an institutional statement pulled from it was. So this one participant mentions that this other person has sometimes pleaded with him to not give him another piece of land to maintain. And the person we were interviewing seemed to be cognizant of the limitations that IG and his staff have and does not want to approach management as triage, like suddenly taking out a big chunk of buckthorn or some other management action that shakes up the system drastically. If the follow-up, the stewardship and the nurturing can't happen afterwards. So this institutional statement then is that the director gives new management projects to the crew only when the follow-up is possible. This happens to be one that with this particular case came up again and again and again. So for this particular agency, this essentially don't bite off more than you can chew and maintain was a fundamental principle that they followed. Here's another example. If we haven't met some of the goals yet, it's probably just time constraints, manpower, that sort of thing. I think we're moving in the right direction toward them, but they're not things that we can do sometimes all in one shot. And even with some of our clearing, we've learned that it's best to do it somewhat slowly so that we can keep up with it and do the follow-up work rather than opening up a huge area and then having resprouts. That's the buckthorn coming back up again and things and other things. Can we then effectively manage the follow-up work to the clearing? Do we have the manpower to do that? Do we have the time? So this is another version of the same issue. And so here the statement is restorationists conduct clearing projects slowly enough so that they can keep up with it and conduct follow-up work. I want to stop for a second and just see, because I feel like I've thrown a lot out there. Do you want to look at that spreadsheet again?
Can I just ask a question about how did you choose the language that you, in the rephrasing? Was that discussions about that? Or did one person say, okay, this is how we're going to rephrase this in the coding?
Right. One of the things was to move from something very specific to a person to something that was more generalized. Like in this case, we aren't saying JR conducts clearing slowly enough, but it's broader. It's the restorationists are doing it more slowly. And some of it is also just trying to condense down to that rule. There was a lot of discussion between Christy and I. I mean, like, and there was one time she came in one morning and said, I swear last night I dreamed I was applying the grammar to my dog. It was just so intensive for months that it was a lot of back and forth. But the institutional statement needs to be cogent. Interview rarely is. People wander, they take the scenic route to a point, if they get to the point. So there is some interpretation that has to happen to move from the interview to the statement. Did that answer your question?
Yes, because in the coding that I've done, we've agonized over it as well because we were doing legal documents. Some of them use different language for the same thing. And so we were changing the language and we felt very conflicted about doing that. Mm-hmm. That's really helpful.
Yeah, and I guess what I might consider in that same point is just making note of where I changed it and why. So that if somebody asked me later, I'd be able to say, well, I did X because. Anybody else? I can't see you. So
yeah, I know. I was just going to interject. There's 3 people with raised hands. I'm not sure if they still have questions.
I do. If I'm in the list, I do.
Okay.
I went first. Thank you. I've read your paper in Policy Studies Journal, and I really enjoyed it. And I just want to speak to the intensity of coding and completely agree. It's been such a hard. It's been really hard for me and for my team to code, and also we are coding across languages, so there are nuances. So the regulations I've been looking at are in Spanish, and it's so complicated. And I speak 5 languages, and I have issues across languages, right? Like I have also looked at water laws in France and in French, and IGT. I mean, a lot of things translate, but a lot of things don't. So, I had this conversation with Chris and with Saba on the fact that coding IGT, it's fantastic, but it is really intense because
Yeah.
you are doing, so you have to choose the method. And my team and I are working on an approach to analyze IGT in Spanish and then do a sort of a translation. So it's also complicated if you, and also the natural language, right? Like we use a lot of arms and on and so on. So it's really hard to just those, those, and even with natural language processing, I recently saw the paper by Saba and Chris, and it's gonna be challenging because there will be things that cannot be captured.
Yeah. Yeah, and the cross language thing where, even just thinking of figuring out the deontics when we use something like must differently across different languages and cultures. Do we mean must in the deontic sense or not? That sounds challenging and fascinating. Anything else?
Nothing in the chat.
Okay.
And no raised hands.
Great. So I'll keep moving along, but jump in whenever you want. So after all of this back and forth between Christy and I, we then combined and discussed lists. We merged duplicates. We noted differences and conflicts. We reviewed it again. We kind of used, there's an idea in Nvivo where, again, you've got that code tree, if you're using the hierarchy. And one of the steps in that analysis process is often rearranging your codes because your thinking has changed and you're seeing different relationships. And remember early on when I was learning it, one of the people well-versed in Nvivo said, one sign that you're getting towards the end of your analysis, you're really settling into it, is you're not rearranging your tree anymore. Well, there was a similar thing here where we were finally not arguing about in a collegial academic arguing about whether something was scope or choice or norm or rule or strategy or norm or what, so we were done with that finally. Was one sign that we were kind of, okay, we're through this, we've got them. There were 16 to 1700 institutional statements that we pulled out of these interviews and notes. They were all uploaded into Nvivo to be able to analyze them in the context of the fuller data set. Remember, we were also coding for emotion. We were coding for perceptions of the land and things like that. We also reported out to our broader social science team so that they could, because they were also reading the interviews and things, or even conducting some of them, to get their feedback as well on did something seem right or off base or whatever. One last step that we did, in part because of some of the ways we then use the institutional statements, which I'll get to in a bit, is in some of our cases, we maybe had 10 interviews, and in another case, we might have had 3 interviews and things. So the quantity of data per case varied. We wanted to be sure that the variance in the number of statements in a case was not an artifact of the differences in the amount of data that we had to pull from. And in fact, it was not. It came up pretty clearly that it was not that if we had 10 interviews, we also had 3 times the institutional statements of the smaller cases. One of the things, in the policy studies paper, we've got a bunch of these decision trees. My office wall was papered with flip chart papers of essentially what were the rough drafts of these, with things like, if you've got a boundary statement, you have to have a position statement. If you've got an aggregation statement, there has to be a choice statement, those sorts of things. And so we figured we might as well type up what we, scrawled across my wall to maybe be of use to other people. So that was the genesis of the sort of flow charts that are throughout that paper. Schluter and Thiesfeld's work on sanctions and the variations in where sanctions might come from were really helpful for us. One of the things that we found and was surprising to us is that we in fact had in the manager group, remember there was the co-management, management, and research led. The manager group actually had more norms. And I would have expected the agency-based folks, being a government employee myself, to be all tied up with formal rules, but in fact, it was more norm-driven. But Schluter and Thiesfeld's, you're probably familiar, but just in case not, the idea of a sanction, a strategy still has a sanction, but it is kind of automatic, right? It happens if you don't do the sanction, the strategy. Like if you drive on the wrong side of the road for whatever country or town you're in, you could get in an accident and that's an automatic sanction. Now there's also emotional norms and tangible fines and license revoked and things that can also happen for that same action. Nonetheless, there are those automatic sanctions for a strategy, emotional sanctions for a norm. So it might be guilt or pride, joy, anger, those sorts of things as the sanctions that happen in a norm versus the tangible rewards or fines or punishments or whatever that might happen in a rule. We found that very helpful in sorting through things. And it also then led to several of the other findings that we'll get to in a minute. I just want to circle back to this whole qualitative data analysis thing. There are a number of traditional quality assurance, quality control checks, including a check for negative evidence and having multiple coders, things like this that are routine in qualitative data analysis are really helpful for this as well. We've talked about multiple coders. That check for negative evidence is, so is there someone saying something that runs contrary to this within this same group? That sort of thing can help you tell if you've really found something that is a rule or norm that is followed. So similarities across these various statements. We found in this instance, in our data, a lack of rules that quantified any inputs or outputs. I'm going to get into this next one in a minute in more detail. We found presence of sanctions from the land. And we found a whole lot of very uniform implementation practices. We had mostly strategies. We had mostly operational level things, which makes sense. We were literally on the ground, right? We were talking about ecological restoration. So we had hardly anything at the constitutional level, mostly at the operational level. We did see some differences between that co-management and manager and research, with co-management having, not surprisingly, a whole bunch more aggregation rules where you had to check with somebody before you did something. That surprise of the managers had more of the norm-based institutional statements. We also found that there was much more of a centrality of public outreach that distinguished the research from the co-management and manager. On the other hand, those were two membership-based organizations that also did research. So public outreach is kind of core to who they are and what they do. Another thing that we did, so here's a graph, and people kind of looked and said, wait, you used the number of institutional statements as its own data? And yeah, we did. And we had, this particular slide is to show we had very few payoff rules anywhere, that we had mostly strategies and then rules and norms after that. But remember, we were looking at trying to differentiate between the different groups and their decision-making and implementation processes and whether there was ecological differences. So we had to merge our data with the ecological data of, counts of threatened endangered species and, in the plots and presence and type of invasive species that were there, and all that sort of thing. And so we used the counts and the types of the institutional statements to describe the different groups themselves. So presence or absence of the aggregation rules, for example. And that then got fed into a variety of different quantitative analyses with the ecological data. And that's reported in one of the 4 links that you got. And the excruciating detail of how we did it is in the social science methods general technical report, GTR, that we also sent the link to that too. So sanctions from the land. So this is one of the things that was really intriguing to me, and I've also seen similar things in work that I've done with farmers and their interest in conservation behavior in Iowa. And that is this sort of idea of they listen to the land. And so we tend to think of sanctions as coming only from other people, right? And institutions as in, human-based organizations. But we've got any number of data points pointing to restorationists and farmers in the other data set feeling, as norm-based things, feeling sanctions from the land. So the language can get pretty powerful in some ways, like this one here with ZC saying, when you finally see the fruits of your efforts and you really see an area getting turned around, saving it from the brink of extinction and death and all, rescuing a beautiful sedge meadow valley from buckthorn. Or JJ, keeps coming up, saying, we managed one of the world's largest populations of prairie fringed orchids. If we don't do it right, the world loses it. There's a purpose and a sense of responsibility to make sure my children and their children see those things. And they also talk about invasives as being and or else, whether it's Phragmites or bittersweet or buckthorn, those are 3 invasive species. It just seems like you're constantly being bombarded. You take it one step forward, but then you get knocked back. And if when you think you've got a handle on it, something else pops up. And if you're not planting the right thing in the right sequence, the place is just going to collapse and it'll open up to weeds and invasion of things. So when they were talking about things, it was very much with emotional sanctions, right? So it was norm-based. So when you think about the common pool resources, you've got actions from the action arena to the biophysical material conditions, goods and services coming back. In this context where we're in more of the value added and it's not farming and herding and things like that, or timber production, there's also place attachment is not completely the right word, but it's the best I've got so far. There's that tie to the land, but we don't have the goods and services circle coming back so strongly here. So I know it's heretical to think about changing the diagram at all, but it's useful here to just make the point that in this context, and also in that farming and conservation context, people are giving agency to the land itself. And in that way, it is, it's a little different in that, yes, they're paying attention to all the other people, but they're also paying attention to what the land is telling them. I'll just make one last point and then we can go to just full-on discussion. One of the other things we started to identify was what we started to call desired statements. They weren't actually institutional statements in use yet, but they were things that people identified that they wished were happening. And we weren't quite sure what to do with them and what they meant, but they came up enough that they felt worth noting, that there were rules and norms people wished were in place. Restorationists should remove large trees to get sunlight into the site. This organization must do a better job of interfacing with the neighbors. But they're in the interviews telling us this isn't happening, but we wish it was. So I think that's enough of me talking.
I guess we'll open the floor to questions.
Mhm.
The chat was busy. There weren't direct questions, but I don't know. Oh, I see a hand. Seth?
Hey, Lynn, my name's Seth. I really appreciate seeing someone else kind of suffer through this sort of effort of extracting institutional statements from non-policy documents. It's been especially rough for me because I have no training in qualitative methods. I've encountered that from learning from people like Saba and Uta and others doing this, that there's a big practice of kind of circling back. I do my code, my translation from the raw text, you do yours, and then we talk it over and come to a decision. That sounds necessary, and it also makes me nervous. It also makes me fearful. After enough of that, you two take each other in a direction that if I go to the same data and do the same process with Uta, we'd come up with different results. This, again, coming as a quantitative scholar and I'm a quantitative scholar out of laziness, right? I want the computer to do this hard agreement work for me. Am I setting unrealistic expectations? Would you say there's a sort of, it's absolutely necessary to do this kind of circling process and maybe put replicability at risk in order to get the level of agreement necessary to really say anything?
I'm not sure you put your replicability at risk.
Okay.
It's not the same as doing, tossing all your data into R and seeing how it lumps it, which you can then use the same code to the same data set and whatever. Let's see, along with those discussions is careful note taking, right? So that, that's where some of that replicability comes in. Okay. You also have that time, like say, then we went to that broader social science team and said, okay, here's where we're landing. And they agreed, but they might have said, what? This makes no sense. That is not at all what we saw in the data. So in fact, it is strengthening the reliability of the results to have more people looking at the data and questioning it. Because it can be, and that search for negative evidence, particularly if you are on your own. Like if you're doing a dissertation, you probably don't have the team that you're working with. You're like alone, at least I was. And you're supposed to be, because it's supposed to be your work, right? So then you might employ more of the search for negative evidence of, am I seeing anything else in the data that contradicts what I'm saying as a rule or a norm? As another way of just checking yourself, and particularly against the desire to find something that we sometimes bring, whether we mean to or not.
Sometimes. All right. Thank you. So what I hear is that it's not tremendously different from any other kind of qualitative process, and that even though there is dialogue and discussion and learning over the process of coding, you're pretty confident that you would have gotten the same results if someone else had done it.
Yeah. And I would also add that when we were sitting in on the discussions with the ecology team about what their data meant, they were also arguing over whether this meant there were, this was a high quality site or not, or what, it's like we debate data.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. Appreciate it.
Any other questions? Adela?
So I really enjoyed your presentation, and it made me think. And so, and about things I hadn't really thought about, some of the challenges of interviewing people and then trying to identify the institutional statements from that. One thing that I thought about was trying to distinguish between strategies and rules, because I could imagine that people would tell you a strategy, but it was really a rule unless you followed up and asked about whether or not, or maybe it was a norm, unless you followed up and asked about sanctioning, like what would happen if you didn't do this, right? You'd follow up with a question like that. So, but then it seems to me that the way you solved that is that you had multiple representations of that same strategy in your interviews, and then you could almost say, well, okay, then this is commonly known, so it's probably a norm or a rule then.
And people did also tell you sanctions. Like there was one that pops to mind because I mean, the language they might use is colloquial, but there was someone from one of the agencies who said, yeah, the volunteers can go talk to the board, which is an elected board. But if I go talk to the board, I get spanked. So, I mean, they said straight up, this is a rule. I cannot talk to the board and then, I mean, we had to translate the get spanked to something more, you know, maybe fired or reprimanded at work. But that was one of our key things was we would look through there. It was like, is there a sanction? Are they hinting at a formal sanction or not? And if we couldn't find the formal sanction in any of our data, we would deem it not a rule. But you do have to have your interview guide set up so that you are asking, so how do you decide? What happens if you don't? What happens if, you know?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
you have to probe for those things in the interviews.
And then I just had one more question for you about this. One of the things that I find challenging is that I can't, and I code, you know, formal statements from documents. I can't tell level of action of a rule, if it's operational, elective choice, or constitutional choice, unless I have a section situation that it's a part of. So then I can tell how I should code that rule or what action. And I was wondering, how did you determine whether something was constitutional collective choice or operational?
Yep. Well, one thing for us, it was so much of it was clearly operational because it was don't walk around in a fragile area after heavy rain. You'll compact the soils. Just very operational. But we did do I'm losing track of my windows. Share screen. This one. Share. It is one of the charts that we've got in the paper, the Policy Journals paper. Let me just go to make this really big. Sorry, it's not behaving the way I want. Okay. We had very few constitutional rules about making rules. And you may well have more of those in the kind of data you're talking about. We had hardly any of those. We debated them sometimes. Is this maybe? Could we find something somewhere? But our stuff had very few of those. We were just pulling from the Ostrom 2005 book and some of the other articles, but mostly that book for how to tell whether it was constitutional collective choice or operational. We had more back and forth sometimes between collective choice versus operational, but was it about planning and establishment of those operational level concerns? Or was it about impacts in the real world? You know, and that's most of what we had, because we were talking about, could you or couldn't you, this person, use a chainsaw? Can you or can't you apply herbicide there? It was very operational for what we were looking at. So this wasn't our big wrestling point. For other projects, it would be. For us, it was strategy, norm, rule. That was and is it scope or choice? Those were the two where
Sure.
we were pounding our head against the wall on.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I should unmute myself. There's a question from Anya.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for the presentation and for your paper, which I read a while ago, and I have to say that it inspired me to write a project application, and now I will realize that project. And I plan to do the interviews and code the interviews using IG. And I was wondering whether in your research, have you considered the issue of the probability or the perceived probability of the sanction to happen? Because when we talk about informal sanctions, we do not analyze the policies and the laws, but informal rules.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is, I think, very important aspect of how, because somebody can talk about a norm, a sanction, a different kind of sanction, like informal one. But in some cases, the probability, the expected probability can be assessed as very low. So they will not really follow that. And in some cases, it can be assessed as very high. And then we can expect people really to follow that. So, yeah.
Or is the likelihood low, but the impact, if it did happen, high? And
exactly.
So follow it anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how strong is the sanction? Yes. How
right. Or how much, or how susceptible is the person to following the rules too? Because some people are going to follow them even if they know that it's never going to be applied, and others are going to flaunt the most stringent of sanctions. Yeah, we didn't look at that, and it's a fascinating question. And I think were I to go at that, I would have probes in my interview guide about, have you ever seen it happen? How often is that? Or something to that effect. But I'll keep an eye out for your work.
I will be in touch. I will start interviews next year, so it's still a lot of time, but I will, if you don't mind, I would really like to write to you and ask some questions, some more questions. Thanks.
Christopher?
Hello. Thanks, Lynn. It was a really great talk, instructive, and a lot of food for thought there. Just a question from a coding perspective. So you talked about the differentiation between norms and rules, of course. And I feel there are, of course, a lot of sanctions that you identified for norms, right, in addition to rules. But just in your discussion with Adela, you highlighted, we're explicitly looking for, formal consequences or formal sanction. As to constitute an institutional statement as a rule as opposed to norm. And my question to you is then, did you code sanctions of informal kind, and what would this institutional statement have been identified as? Would it have been a rule or a norm, or because you're kind of deviating then a bit from the idiomatic use of the statement?
Yeah. So what we followed was whether it was to be a rule, it needed to be a more formal sanction that was, a reward or a punishment, that sort of thing. If norm-based, for norm-based stuff, it was more emotional. So shunning or getting chewed out, or feeling guilty. That came up in our data. Feeling guilty came up a lot. Feeling like you had either abandoned the needs of future generations or abandoned the needs of the land. Came up a lot. Guilt was all through it for the norm side of things. So that's where we use the Schluter and Biesfeld work a lot. An automatic sanction strategy, an emotional sanction norm, a formal sanction of some sort rule.
Okay, well, that's helpful.
So yeah, that saved us. Otherwise, we were just losing our minds.
Thank you very much for the clarification. That's really helpful.
Okay, we have Yutong. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And then Seth had a question in chat.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Yutong, and thank you so much for this fascinating work. And I noticed that you have used the number of institutional statements to make a difference between non-management and managers. I am wondering if there is any emotional patterns across different actors or participants. Because like in addition to positive and negative emotions, I think maybe there is something like neutral emotions emerging in the data. And I'm wondering if you have been paying attention to those neutral emotions in the study. And yeah, that's my question.
Yeah. Okay, let me think for a moment. I mean, yes, we coded for emotion finely. As in, we had, how many? Well, we coded for amazed and awe, angry, appreciative, concern and care, disappointed, disgust, distressed, excited, fear, anxiety, etc. Through. So we coded for lots of different nuances of emotion. We had an environmental psychologist along for the ride so that, you know, we got it right. And yes, they are then coded also as positive and negative. And there wasn't much that was neutral. The emotions tended to be positive or negative, and those did get included in the variables for the analysis with the ecological data. So the number of positive and negative emotions coded. What surprised me was that the norms, and remember the norms are going to be those emotion-based sanctions, were more prevalent for the managers. And that still surprises me. Years later, that surprises me because I would have expected the volunteers to be more emotion-driven. On the other hand, they had to function with the owners of the land, and so maybe that's where the rules ended up coming in and kind of swamping it. But the prevalence of emotion guiding behavior among the managers was a surprise. And I don't feel like I've quite answered your question, Yutong, but hopefully there's something in there that's useful.
Yeah, thank you. Because I'm asking this because I thought emotional analysis may be helpful for us to understand the tension embedded in the data, because policymakers may have different policy stances toward different target groups. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
But thanks for your answer.
You're welcome.
Let me, I get Ute queued me up, but let me defer to Angelo.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask, it's 3 o'clock. So Lynn, do you still have time? There's two more questions. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Angelo then.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. My name is Angelo. I'm one of Saba's students at Syracuse. And I know this question might be a little bit out of the, out of the scope of when you did this research. But, you know, when you were talking about like people, you know, feeling this sense of responsibility and like norms and whatnot, I just am curious to ask though, like, if from what you remember when we were talking, in thinking context of like how these institutional grammar and people talking institutional statements and like thinking of how I'm thinking like policy compliance and behavioral directives. Do you perhaps remember like if you felt people were like more motivated because of feelings of guilt or like feelings of social disapproval from their peers and colleagues from all the different levels? Hopefully that question makes sense. And sorry, I'm driving to grad school.
I can see you're in the car. I thought you're very committed to being here. Yeah, I would say guilt. Now, and what's interesting is that is in the context of there having been a lot of tension around restoration in the 90s in the Chicago area, enough that there was a moratorium on restoration activities in one of the counties for 10 years, a shorter term moratorium in another county. So, emotions were running high. It was highly contested. But again, we're talking operational level, right? We're talking about, are we going to cut out the buckthorn and herbicide it, or just cut it? Or are we going to cut it and we're going to burn? So there was less, in our context, there was less of that chance of arguments. Although, remember that one quote I read where the guy said, "Is the door closed?" And he's just talking about someone's choosing to seed or not. I'll be honest that I found that a little confusing. What was so sensitive about some site managers seed more than others? But he thought there was something sensitive about that. So clearly there is some concern about what other people are going to say or think, and people feel passionately about their approach to ecological restoration. But I still say one of the stronger motives was that combo of guilt responsibility.
Okay.
Thank you. I love that. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah. Great commitment, Angelo. Next time we meet, we're going to have a chat about Zooming and driving. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you so much, Lynn. It looks like the questions, I'm just checking chat here. Seth has left, unfortunately, had to go to another meeting. So yeah, those are all our questions. Thank you so much for your time and for the very interesting presentation.
Thank you. And I just put my email in the chat if you want to reach me.
Yeah, and if you don't catch it in the chat, email me and I'll connect you with Lynn.
Okay.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. Have a nice weekend, everybody. See you next month.